If I haven't met you all already, I'm Michael Haley Goldman. I am the Executive Director of New Hampshire Humanities, and we're very, very glad to have you all here as part of this workshop, but also really appreciate Holly doing this workshop with us. It was a kind of a last minute opportunity where we had the ability to put these workshops together, and I really appreciate Holly jumping in with both feet and making this happen. Also appreciation to Katie, who has been managing it from the New Hampshire Humanities end. So thank you both. This is really exciting. As I was just saying, Holly and I have been talking about how do we better support the work of oral history within the state. I think you all probably have seen Holly before. If you haven't, she has a great resume at UNH and has been working on the Seacoast LGBTQ plus oral history project and other oral history projects for quite a long time. And so I won't waste more of your time with that, but thank you for being here. Please do fill out the surveys that you get because we would like to do more of this work. And what you tell us you want is what we're going to work on. So that's an opportunity to make sure we do more of what you need. So thanks for being here, and I'll turn it right away to Holly.
Fantastic. And I'm going to jump in and share my screen for a minute, and then I'm going to unshare it when hopefully people will introduce themselves and talk a little bit if you're wanting to share about your projects. So this is just a little bit of an overview of what I'm hoping that we can get through today. And like I said, asking for you to share a little bit this time about your projects and whether there's a specific concern or concerns you have related to making them accessible that you want to kind of flag up at the beginning of the workshop today. And then I'm hoping we can look at kind of three different aspects of the question of access. What are the kind of issues you might want to think about before you start a project? What to do with your recordings after they're recorded to with a mind towards access, and then kind of what are the deliverables that you might be thinking about for your project, and what are some other ways of using the oral histories that might make them connect with people differently or connect with different groups of people across the lifespan of the project and beyond. And then I'm hoping there'll be time for some Q&A at the end before we start our case study. I also have a couple of examples. I'm not sure if I'm able to share video successfully or not, but I can at least show a couple of different websites that have platforms that people might be interested in using. And then we have Karen Schuster, and I hope Michael Provost will be able to sign on from, oh, I think I wrote that incorrectly. I think it's singular, Newmarket Story Project. And they will be sharing their case study this workshop. Sorry about having the name of that wrong. And and then we'll be able to ask them questions in general about their project or specifically about the question of access. And then we'll have time at the end to wrap up, and I'll again link to the Google Doc with resources related to this topic added, and then ask your ideas about next steps to support your projects. So this is me again. You've seen this before every workshop, but today I'm adding a new disclaimer. I've said before that I'm not a historian, and today I'm adding, because of the topic, I'm not an archivist or a librarian, and some of you all might be. So you might have more expertise than I do in some of these topics. And so please, 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 please jump in and share your ideas and your experiences, because they might be helpful to all of us as we're thinking about the question of access. So I stopped my sharing and I'm going to copy the questions I just put into the chat, and ask for people. Actually, I might call on people because we're not all in the same order on everybody's screens. And so I'll ask you to unmute yourself and share again where you're joining from, a little bit about the project you're working on, and any challenge you're thinking about in terms of accessibility. If you're not working on a specific project, but you have a general question about oral history projects and access, feel free to throw that in as well. So I'll call on first the Natural Historical Society because I see folks are there ready to unmute.
Well, we're from the National Historical Society. I'm Sarah. This is Jeremy, our documentary volunteer, and this is Beth, our curator.
I'm on the side.
Jeremy, would you like to talk about the project?
Yeah, so the project we're doing is on the mills on the Merrimack, focusing on the Lowell Mill, the National Manufacturing Company, and of course the Manchester Mill, and just how that led to the development of New Hampshire and where the cities are located, as you know, Massey and New Hampshire population increase and where the jobs were. So.
And what's the biggest challenge?
Biggest challenge with this, I would say, is trying to get interviews with people that are linked directly to the mills, people who had family work there, and of course, you know, with the mills having closed, you know, a couple generations ago, kind of trying to get some anecdotes from children of people that work there. So.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. And right, that question of identifying the best narrators for the project is a really important one. Okay, how about Wendy?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm from Hampton Falls Historical Society and also the library. And we had an extensive project back in 2017 where we interviewed about 10 longtime residents of our town to capture their memories of our small seacoast New Hampshire town. And they went back to World War II memories. We recorded them in our museum. I did a video recording, and then I transcribed that, so I had just audio. And so I feel like I went through a pretty good process of saving and sharing that. I have the audio and the video backed up on external hard drives. We have a playlist on our YouTube channel where people can go and just watch each individual interview. And we also I worked with a team and we created a 1 hour long movie called Memories of Hampton Falls. And that's on our website as well, so that we can link any newsletters and all. But I feel like that was in 2017. So a lot of people have forgotten about it, don't see it anymore, don't go there. So our challenge going forward is to work those interviews in another way. And one thought I had for a project is, for example, we have a one-room schoolhouse that's sort of a museum. If I pulled out all of the things they said about schools in our town and put them together and did something with that. The other project we want to do, and I'm not sure how to approach it, is in our library. We thought we might like to have sort of like a oral history station, a place where people could walk in, but maybe we would have to have some topics or questions or some guidelines so that they would answer those. And then those, you know, once we collect it, I feel like I'm pretty good at then figuring out how to technologically save it, share it, put it together. But the challenge is the volume of interview things that I might have and how to pick good topics so that they're not rambling on about whatever. And then how to continue to share these in an appropriate way going forward. So that's
Fantastic. Fantastic. Those are excellent questions. And we will touch on some of them. And I hope that you bring some of them back up throughout as it's relevant with what we're talking about. Fantastic. Sally,
Hello, good morning.
good morning.
So I'm with the Newbury Historical Society. We're an all-volunteer group, which makes our situation a little different than some of the bigger groups that have people that have a job that can focus on it. We're doing similar to what Wendy said. We're collecting stories and memories of living in our little town of 2,000 people, Newbury, New Hampshire. We've conducted 5 interviews so far with 6 different people. One was a husband and wife that did it together. I've been putting them up on our webpage, but what I am concerned about is these are about 40-minute interviews. So I think it's not very bite-sized to have a 40-minute, set of 40-minute interviews on a webpage. And I know even for me, with my interest in oral histories, I find it hard to sit down and think, okay, I'm going to click play now with a 40-minute interview. That number one. And number two is our website is not heavily trafficked. So I'm just afraid that, they're up there. We really wanted to catch these interviews before we lost the elders of our community. We're starting with our elders. So we are capturing them now, but the question is how to make it really accessible to the community. And I guess all the topics you're talking about today.
Fantastic. Great point about the length of oral histories and our attention span these days. I think we tend to say like that's an issue that affects kids, but I think it's an issue that affects all of us. And so how to bite-size things, how to make them more more interactive in that way. Fantastic. Jenny.
So I am working with a group that is at the very, very beginning of something that I'm hoping will be a big program. Working with Able New Hampshire. I'm a disability historian and activist, I guess. But it's about memorializing Laconia, the Laconia State School. And in part of that, we wanted to do an oral history about, I guess we would probably want to talk to town people. We'd want to talk to any survivors. And I guess we're in the very, very early, like we need to get grants and everything in order to go. And I'm just looking to see how oral history could play into this, plays in a memorialization, and how it can be used as a tool in more statewide education efforts for disability. So getting that out and really accessible to teachers, I would say, would be my big question for this session.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you, Jenny. I see Chris Carm. Is that
Carmichael?
yes?
Hi.
She's with me.
Oh, fantastic.
yes,
Fantastic.
yeah.
We will skip you then because we will hear about that later. Skip Karen
That
as
is
well.
absolutely fine.
How about Dot?
I'm Dot Bork from Webster Historical Society. We're another tiny town. We have fewer than 2,000 people. But the biggest thing that I can contribute here is that back in the bicentennial, the people who were in the society at the time, and I was not here, in 1975 through 77, they started recording the oral histories and the memories of the people. So as a historic society, we were just as interested in what they could remember and the stories that their grandparents told as we were in, the current events and what people thought about them. So our slant was just a little different from what you define as an oral history, but I think they're still quite relevant now. I have taken the cassettes and um, digitize them, and we store all of our archival stuff in Google Drive. So you can listen to it anytime, any place. You don't have to sit in front of your screen to do it. But we have only a few of them transcribed. There are probably 20 or 30 tapes in all, but they're all digitized now. So we're quite happy about that.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you. Oh, and now my screen just changed, which means the order went awry. And how about Stephen?
Hey there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, I'm Steve Osiak. I'm with the Kensington, New Hampshire Historical Society. Just joined the board, so really I'm here to just sort of learn the basics about oral history. We don't have a project that we're currently working on, but the suggestion was made to every year we have our old home days, and we have a little yard sale at the one-room schoolhouse that we have here. And what I'm told is a lot of people come back to that from afar saying, hey, I grew up in New Hampshire. I grew up in this town, came back to see the schoolhouse again. So the thought was maybe during our next uh, old home days, sort of set up a little interview booth and maybe do some oral histories for these people that come back if they're willing to share their stories. So again, I'm really just learning this from the ground up with this workshop. So
Fantastic.
that's kind of where we're at.
Thank you so much for sharing. And
You're welcome.
we heard that in our first case study with the folks from Cheshire County Historical Society, and then again now with a couple of people, the idea of wanting to have like a little story booth, kind of a little place, whether it's a pop-up or something more permanent. So that is really interesting to think about moving forward, kind of best practices for what that space could look like and what is most effective. Nancy.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Sorry for the delay. It took me a while to get in.
No worries at all. We are, so you probably don't even know the questions. We're just, I'm asking people, and I put in the chat, kind of where are you joining from if you're representing a group, and if you have a project you're working on related to oral history, what is it? And if you have any specific question or concern related to the topic of this deep dive, which is access.
I'm working solo and mostly interested in helping develop oral history within my own family to share with children and nieces and nephews and grandchildren and, moving forward because, my own experience in my family was my grandmothers both, telling their stories and nobody except my mom writing it down. And so, all we have is limited information. So the more I can get to pass on to others, the more I think they will enjoy it.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I love that kind of personal motivation and looking at the family and passing stories down. And some of these same issues, right, are going to come up, whether it's digitized oral histories in a historical society or recordings that are in your family, in your personal collection. I see New Hampshire Historical Society. Good
Sure.
morning.
Good morning. Excuse me. So I'm Sarah Galligan. I run the library and archives here at the New Hampshire Historical Society. We don't have any current ongoing oral history projects. We do have a lot of legacy oral history projects. So things that started like Webster maybe in the 70s. So different types of tapes, different kinds of recordings on different topics. So I'm just kind of absorbing all the information. So
Fantastic. And the question of legacy projects, how to proceed with them, if it's possible to kind of bring a renewed interest to them, and what concerns there might be in terms of access is a really interesting one. So that is something that we can hopefully talk about later as well. Okay, just a few people left, so we're going to have plenty of time, which is good. Molly, and then maybe Elizabeth, and finally Bernadette. I think those are the last three people.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, good morning.
Hi, I am with the Black Heritage Trail in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I'm currently
Wonderful.
working on a grant-funded project with their archives, research room, and oral history project. So the oral history project was conducted in the 80s and 90s, and it's the first time that we're digitizing them and kind of going through the work that the founder of Black Heritage Trail has done previously. So we're trying to get them ready for to be accessible, as the founder does not want them accessible until after she passes. So we're just kind of in that process of trying to get them ready for that. The problem that we're having is that sometimes the audio is a little funky and you can't really hear what's going on. And we are only working with partial transcripts of them as well, as the interviewer did kind of edit them a little bit. So kind of we're just trying to make sure that we have all the accurate information and have them accessible and able to be utilized for research, as they are really important, as a lot of these people talk about their experience of being Black in New Hampshire.
Amazing. And so another legacy project, and some of the typical legacy concerns of audio quality, incomplete context, sometimes incomplete content information. And sometimes there's also questions about consent and rights and privacy and all of those things, which might have been some of the motivations for the editing. So really interesting example, Molly. Thank you. Bernadette. Oh, we cannot, at least I cannot hear you. It looks like you're unmuted, but I can't hear you. Okay, we will skip you for now. If you want to add something in the chat, feel free to do that. And then we'll jump over to Elizabeth, and hopefully we'll be able to hear a little bit from you later if we can. Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. I'm coming from Fort Stark over in Newcastle, New Hampshire. We have an employee over there who served in the Navy at Fort Stark when it was an active military base in the 1970s. And he now works there as an interpreter, and he helps take care of the property. So we are going to do an oral history, not only talking about his time in the service, but then also just sort of walking around and having him talk about the changes to the property. Our biggest sort of issue we're coming into with making it accessible is just making sure that as we're developing this project, it's our first oral history through my work. And so we want to develop procedures and policies that we're all following moving forward. So we're sort of looking at a couple of different organizations that have done large scale ones, the National Park Service, and kind of combining all that information together to make procedures. So it's really just a bandwidth and timing issue with us, I think, of we have some great ideas and some great questions, but it might take us 3 to 5 to who knows how many years to kind of get it together.
Fantastic. And I think, right, one of the things that I have recommended before and continue to recommend is exactly what you're doing, is looking at other projects for inspiration, looking at other projects for sometimes, oh, let's not make that mistake that they made. And as much as you can kind of get those ducks in a row beforehand, it will help you in the long term. And then balancing that with kind of just starting because you don't want to miss out on opportunities to record people, especially when you might not have a lot of potential narrators left who have firsthand experience of something. So great perspective. And thank you everybody for sharing. I am really excited to hear about all of your projects, and hope that you'll continue to chime in throughout the presentation. If you use the raise hand feature, or if you want to add something in the chat, please please do so. And if we missed, oh, I should ask before we continue, did we miss anyone in the introductions? Did I skip over anyone? My participants kind of resorted themselves once, and I might have missed someone. Okay, I'm not hearing any unmuting or raising of hands. I know two folks, Karen and her collaborator, will get to in the case studies. So I think we're good. Okay, so I'm going to continue with this first kind of, we've talked about interviewing in the last deep dive, and how to prepare to make the interview as successful and fruitful as possible. And so in this quote, I just wanted to share this from Oral History Association, this idea that preparation, interviewing, preservation, and access are the four key elements. And almost all of the trainings and tutorials and all of that you find focus on the preparation and interviewing. Maybe a little bit about the preservation, but the question of access, kind of what are we doing this for? And for most people, it is for people to actually listen to the oral histories and hear what we've been able to record. Unfortunately, oral historian Michael Frisch shares with us that the deep, dark secret of oral history is that nobody spends much time listening to or watching recorded and collected interview documents. And from what some of you have already shared, this isn't a big surprise, because you've encountered some of that yourself already with your projects. But I don't know if folks have I have ideas about why this might be, other than what's already been shared. But some of the issues that that might cause oral history interviews to kind of sit in an archive unlistened to have to do with things people have already mentioned a little bit, kind of if there's just an audio file or a video file that is, an hour long, not too much context, not too much information about what's in the recording, it's a commitment to hit play and listen to the whole thing. And sometimes the audio quality is not ideal. Sometimes the interviews are meandering and test people's level of interest. And so what are kind of some of the things we can do to make the recordings we have spent so much time and effort and energy investing in more accessible, and have them be used more? So I have one example. I hope this is going to work. One example I have here is just two totally fake potential listings in on a website or in a catalog. We have A on the left that just says, this is an oral history. It's 38 minutes, audio recording, date unknown. And then on the right, entry B, we have a photo of an oral history narrator, and it says oral history, 38 minutes, audio recording with Bernice S. Plumley, Belmont, New Hampshire, recorded December 13th, 1962. So just looking at A and B here, which one might you be more likely to click on? And my guess is that most people would say B, right? So you have a visual, you have a name, you have a place, a date. All of those things might make the oral history seem more interesting, more relevant, more compelling. Um, do people have ideas of what other things could be added to the listing that might inspire even more interest, or in get someone to click on it? Okay, Sally Harris in the chat says topics covered. Exactly. So what is in this oral history? What is Bernice Plumley going to be talking about? An interesting quote. Excellent, Elizabeth. So pulling out a quote, pulling out something from Bernice's own words that might capture people's interest. Any other thoughts? A short video clip? Okay, great. So, right, pressing play on a whole 38-minute oral history might seem daunting, but if there's a short clip that you can hear Bernice in her own words, it might pique people's interest, and it might be that they just listen to that clip, and that's it, and that might be more than they would have done before. Or it might be that they're like, wow, this is really interesting, I want to hear more. And so they might listen to more of it. So those are fantastic, fantastic ideas. I will share my, again, total mock-up hypothetical oral history here. We have I didn't think of the idea of an interesting quote, but I did include an index. You can tell from the fact that these all end in 000 that this is a totally fake index of what Bernice might have talked about, and a summary of what this interview might have been like, with a little bit of a description of the context. So who did the interview? What was the interview done for? And a little bit about who Bernice was. Like I said, this is a completely hypothetical oral history. Bernice is actually my great-grandmother, and we do not have a recording of her voice, and that's something I'm very sad about. I have this photograph of her, and she died just when I was born. And so related, I think, oh, was it Nancy? This is one of the reasons I'm all for your idea about doing your personal family oral history, because it is fantastic to be able to have access to those stories about your family. So what to think about in terms of access before you start. I think the audience, thinking about who do you want to be accessing these oral histories? What do you imagine will be the audience for the oral histories, is a great thing to start out with, and is kind of a way to think about maybe what are the formats that might be most appealing for this audience. Where does this audience tend to be? Are there events, for example? Are there places where folks who are in this group that you want to reach with these oral histories, where they get together, what they participate in? And those ideas, I think it was Steve from Kensington that mentioned this old home days kind of event, which could be a great opportunity for collecting oral histories, like you mentioned, and it could also be a great opportunity for sharing oral histories that you have collected. So thinking about audience in the beginning, who is this for, and how might that impact how you'd be able to reach them and encourage them to access the oral histories. So there's lots of practical considerations about storage, about file size, servers, all of that kind of thing that will vary depending on your your organization and your capacity. I think that is an issue, a technical issue that probably would be better kind of dealt with on a one-on-one basis, but it is something to think about when you think about access, just because of the question of are people going to be able to access this without downloading huge files? Are the files going to be able to be or file types going to be able to be updated as technology changes? So keeping something, personally as an individual versus having files that are in a library or in an organization where, like New Hampshire Historical mentioned, or Molly mentioned, where later generations of caretakers of this legacy project might be able to update the files and continue to make them accessible beyond the lifespan of a given technology. So having that idea of where these are going to end up, what is the archive or repository where they'll live. And then finally, ahead of time thinking about what kinds of metadata you will need to collect to be able to give the appropriate context for each of these oral history projects. Of course, you can decide partway through, oh, I really wish we'd had this information, and then kind of backtrack and try to track down information from earlier interviews. For example, you might keep track of who the narrator is, but maybe you didn't think to keep track of who the interviewer is if you have lots of volunteer interviewers, or you've written down the dates that the interviews took place, but maybe you didn't write down the location. So those kinds of things, if you have an idea ahead of time of all of that information that you want to include, it's definitely easier, not impossible, to go back later. And of course, sometimes those cells in a spreadsheet will just be empty for some of the files. But if you can start a project with a spreadsheet and adding in all of those categories, filling in all of those cells with what you want to know about each recording, that can definitely make the process easier on the other end. Anyone have other thoughts about things before you start that you're thinking about or wanting to resolve related to access?
I have a question.
Sally.
I mean, in a perfect world, if you could have every interview flow the same way and cover the same topics, it would make, indexing it and structuring it much more easy. But we start with the same interview guide for every interview, but of course they go different directions, and people talk longer about some topics than others, and people loop back and talk about things that we talked about more earlier. And I find that to be sort of a challenging thing to think about as we think about trying to do this, I guess.
Yes. Oh, such a great point. I think, right, you can ask the same or plan to ask the same questions in the same order, and no two interview will go in the same order. And it just, you're absolutely right. And so having an idea of what kind of content you're going to be getting is a great start, but then you will be kind of constantly adding to that list of keywords and constantly creating new segments and indexes. And if you have full transcripts for all of the interviews in your project, that can also help you go back and search. So you've decided you're going to add a keyword, motherhood or early schooling or whatever you hadn't thought of before, you can go back and maybe use keywords, search in the transcript for whether it comes up in other interviews that were looked at prior to, you know, your decision to add new keywords. But yes, absolutely, that would be ideal. And also it never happens. The kind of thinking later in an interview, oh, I wish I'd brought this up, and then looping back, you see that a lot in the indexes where it's like a return to World War II or back to the question of education. And right, you don't want to miss out on those things. You're glad that the narrator brings them up, but it does make it less neat later, for sure. Okay, I'm jumping to the next slide, but if anyone wants to jump back in on that idea of before you get started, feel free.
Holly?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Karen.
We'll be talking about this more during our case study, but I think we ran into this issue somewhat with people jumping here and there, and we would ask follow-up questions. But then what we decided to do at the end was, instead of having each person's whole interview, we were pulling out what you call the keywords, we're calling themes, and selecting those from all the different people that we interviewed. So then we could go into each one separately. We were doing a lot of cutting and pasting, basically.
Yes.
But I'll explain more later.
Always keeping that original file safe and secure and backed up, and then cut and paste away in the copies of the file. Exactly. And some of the technology that exists makes that cutting and pasting now so much easier than it used to be, which we can talk about as well. So after you've done the recordings, now you have the what to do with the recordings to try to make them more accessible. And this is just kind of picking up on some of the ideas we've already touched on. Transcribing. So having a complete written transcript of each interview is helpful because it is much more easily searched with kind of a find word feature of whatever format you're using for your transcribing. You can use the transcript to search much more easily than you can search through, say, a 70-minute or a 45-minute audio or video file. These days with technology, the transcribing can be very, very fast, very, very easy, sometimes with not too much money. There are automatic transcription services like Rev, for example, where it's just kind of pennies, pennies for the minute. And with AI technology, they can be pretty accurate if the audio quality is very good, especially if the narrator speaks very clearly and does not have an accent. But even with some of those kind of less clear and accented speech, the accuracy is just going up and up and up. Of course, there's the flip side of that, which is what are they doing with your data, and how might it be used to train AI? And does that align with the priorities of your organization? And all of those questions about using certain technology platforms and what the real costs might be other than the stated costs. Indexing also is something that, depending on your technology, can either be a very slow process where individuals are listening to the oral histories and with knowledge of the project, making decisions about what are the topics that are of interest, how detailed to be, how general you want the categories to be. Something that you can also do is as you're dividing those segments and giving them a title or a topic, you can also summarize. So if someone doesn't want to listen to the whole thing or wants to know kind of generally what the person talks about before clicking on the section, you might have a little summary of a section, and I can show you an example of that. And then people have also mentioned clips. So using clips, creating clips of the most interesting points of the interview, or creating clips across all of the interviews that are related to a specific topic to be able to cluster them and use them in different ways, but kind of by clustering them by topic, reaching people who might be specifically interested in that topic, will make them more engaging. Do people have comments or questions about any of transcribing or indexing specifically?
Just wondering if people have recommendations of services that they've liked for transcribing or indexing. It's kind of overwhelming when you look into it, and especially for smaller groups like ours, a lot of them look expensive. And I tried one, I can't remember what it was called, Otter or something, or but it didn't okay job. It would have taken a lot of work to correct that transcription.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had that experience with Rev as well, getting using the automated transcription as kind of a first pass to get words pretty thoroughly down on the page, but then using humans to go through the transcript as they listen to the audio or video and correct people's names, place names, things that are specific to a region might be more challenging than others. There are transcription services also that have actual humans who are doing the transcription, and those are of course more expensive. Does anyone have, to answer Sally, does anyone have services they've used that have been really successful, or examples that they would not recommend?
We tended to use Live Transcribe on our phones, which is free. It's not perfect in terms of picking up everything. Some of it comes out really strange, but what's worked for me is if I have the video and I'm listening to the video, and then I have my phone next to the video doing the live transcribe, and I'm taking notes at the same time, then I can always go back to the video if I've missed some things. And then I can make better sense of the live transcribe. And so then I come out with a whole, hopefully correct version of the whole story. So it's, it takes a while. It's work, but it's free. And we're all volunteers, so we didn't have money to spend.
And it's definitely something in terms of like what to think about ahead of time as you're planning a project, thinking about that cost as part of what you would work into a grant application or a funding application is definitely something that could help it go faster and could make it less, creating the transcripts less time intensive. The trade-off is that if you don't have humans who are knowledgeable about the project and the community, you might miss things that are relevant or interesting that that other people or machine transcriptions might not pick up on. So again, that's another trade-off. Although I will say it is frightening how good some of them are. And I'm hoping we have time to look at an example. If so, the platform that I've been using is called Their Story, and it is quite expensive. But they do have I do think they take into consideration the size of the organization and the resources, and do makes arrangements for different groups, but it is expensive. Their automated transcribing, indexing, and summarizing, I mean, it's stunning. It's creepy, I would say. It goes beyond stunning. It's almost scary. And hopefully we can look at an example of that. So the last part of access that we wanted to touch on is kind of what possible outcomes or products or deliverables might you have from the Oral History Project, and how might you think about using different ways of reaching people. So kind of the traditional a website with videos that are the full length of the interview with maybe the narrator's name is the kind of most traditional example. And I've linked to some of those in the Google Doc in the past. Maybe the sense of context of the project, because if it's a website that's related to the specific project, you'll at least get that context. If it's in an archive or just kind of in a general listing in a library collection, that information may or may not be there. And that tends to be kind of the least accessible option, although with with computers and ability to access these online remotely, it's more accessible than kind of tapes sitting in a box in an archive. So that is one big step towards being accessible. Then the ability to make clips, so doing that kind of editing that Karen was talking about, taking out topics from across oral histories and organizing them topically by content, using them in different places, such as in social media, in exhibits, using them, being able to share via YouTube channel. I think someone, was it Wendy, I think, mentioned having a YouTube channel with your oral histories. And that can be great also as a place where the files can, a version of the files can live and be linked to in lots of other ways, such as social media. The possibility of creating a book, so a print resource that people might want to buy and keep or have in the local library and other places. Documentary, someone already mentioned this too, creating a documentary with clips from the oral histories and maybe other sources. And clips can also be used in a podcast. So there's this example I'm most familiar with, this fantastic podcast called, I'm going to forget the name of it right now. I'll come back to it in a second. Oh, it's called Making Gay History, and it is using clips from oral histories that were collected in the 80s and 90s and kind of recasting them. The clips, rather than using the full interview, is a way of telling a more controlled story without a lot of digressions that tend to be time consuming and not necessarily as interesting to the listener. So podcast, digital stories. I can link, I think I already did put a link to the Oral History Center at the University of Winnipeg. If not, I will link that on the Google Doc. They use clips from oral histories and sometimes drawings, sometimes photos, and other elements to make a digital story about an individual's life. So we can look at, and if I'm able to share video, we can look at an example of that too. And then an exhibit. So how to make an interactive kind of bring in an interactive oral history aspect to an exhibit, whether it's having a iPad and people can click on the oral histories, or having them playing on loop, having different oral histories playing in different places where they're related to the exhibits, just pulling out quotes, presenting them visually with photographs of individuals. Those can really enhance the community's interest in going and looking at the full oral histories that you have in your on your websites or in your archive. And they can also just reach people who wouldn't normally be accessing those and we'll see them in the context of an exhibit and be able to encounter them there. And then finding ways of including oral histories maybe in the curriculum. So a lot of people have talked about an interest in kind of that intergenerational work. And if there are local teachers and educators who might be interested in collaborating with you, we talked about that kind of in the interview deep dive. Teachers and potentially their students as interviewers, and then kind of bringing it full circle, the idea of having these oral histories feed into the curriculum in some way, and working with local educators to see what ways would be most accessible, most interesting. Any other thoughts about ways of using oral histories that might go beyond kind of just the video and transcript on a website? Other ways that you've used oral histories or that you've engaged with oral histories? Not seeing anyone unmuting or raising your hand. So I'm going to go on to the next slide, but don't hesitate to jump in if you think of something later. Oh, so we could look at these couple of examples, or we could wait. I might want to wait and look at them after Karen and Chris talk. But I have an example of oral history metadata synchronizer, which is a platform that is free, which is always exciting, and hopefully it stays that way. And also has a viewer that can work well for being a public way of accessing an oral history. And I have a link to that in the Google Doc. And then I mentioned their story. We can look at an interview on their story, and I can show you a little bit about that if people are interested. And then we have, oh, I just wanted to also mention, as we're talking about access, I wanted to just quickly mention the question of accessibility before turning things over to Karen and Chris, that in thinking about accessing oral histories, thinking about kind of what are the different ways that people might have challenges in accessing oral histories. And Brad Rakert had a great article from a little over 10 years ago about the kind of primarily audio only nature of a lot of traditional or legacy oral history projects, and how hearing loss might impact your ability to access them. And so questions of audio quality, the length of interviews, and the energy it takes to have to pay attention for that long, especially if you're having a harder time hearing, and how working in things like visual speech cues, contextual support, like having an index or having a transcript that you can follow along with as you're listening, using segments and kind of leaving time in between for processing on the part of the user, and also the possibility of having sign language interpretation, which I had never thought about, the idea of creating a live sign language interpretation of an oral history and recording that as an additional artifact to go along with the recording. Jenny, I see you have a hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a really good example of that is Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. Did a great, and it's you can just Google it and find it on YouTube. And they're short clips of the sign language that people on Martha's Vineyard delivered, and they have it transcribed on there for people that are hearing impaired, and also demonstrations of that sign language. And I thought that was a really cool thing when I was looking.
Fantastic. And that's something I hadn't even been thinking about, but yeah, so the kind of even the term oral history is kind of a very skewed term, and there, of course, having a sign language history is a whole other level of way of communicating and way of sharing stories, that with the use of video and with video files now being able to be smaller and more easily usable, being able to record not just a sign language interpretation of an oral history, but a signed history is fantastic. I'm really excited to check out that resource, and I will track it down and put it into the Google Doc as well. Yeah, I see. I'm forgetting your name, but from National Historical Society.
Yeah, anything that you're able to upload to YouTube as well, they've got the subtitles on there that'll automatically go on. So that's another option.
Yeah, that's a great point. And people have criticized YouTube's subtitles. I think they are hopefully going to be getting better, like so much else is getting better with voice recognition. But again, using that kind of even as a first pass and then being able to edit the subtitles is fantastic. And then we'll see with the oral history metadata synthesizer, being able to have a video that's on YouTube linked to in their viewer, and being able to follow along with the transcription and the video. So that kind of the subtitle option is really a really good point as well. Any other thoughts on accessibility? Okay, so I'm going to turn things over. I'm going to stop sharing now after I put up this slide. So I had Karen and Michael Provost on here, but it looks like Chris Carmichael is here. And so I want to mention you as well. And I'm excited to introduce them to talk more about the Newmarket Story Project. And I'll ask them some questions. You can ask some questions. Share your questions you have in the chat if you want. Don't wait until the end of their presentation. Pop your questions into the chat as you have them. And oh, I'm trying to spotlight Karen and Chris, so everyone can see you. I think that's working. Take it away.
Okay. Hi, everybody. And Michael was on for a little bit, and then I guess he jumped off because I did see his name come up as guest.
Okay, I'm going to look through the participants just to make sure I'm not missing him.
Okay. And I'll kind of start and do a little overview and have Chris jump in, or if I get stuck, I'll have her jump in. I just wanted to say, I wish we had been able to have these workshops way back when we started, because we were just winging it, basically. And we started back in, I think our first meeting was in August of 2022. And it started because I had seen a poster from Hampton, New Hampshire, and they were having get-togethers with authors and townspeople who wanted to tell their stories. And it was on a Wednesday, and I was taking a writing course on Wednesday, so I couldn't go. But I wanted to be there. And then I thought, well, we could probably do something like this in Newmarket. You know, we have a lot of great people. We have about 7,000, 7,500 residents. So it's not a huge town. But it's not a little town either. So it might be doable if we could get some folks together who were interested. So we started having some meetings. Some people dropped out. We got new folks on board. And luckily, 3 of those people are from the Newmarket Historical Society. So Chris and her husband, John is the president. Chris Carmichael, John is a longtime Newmarket resident. Michael Provo is a longtime Newmarket resident, and he's been a member of the Historical Society forever, I think, since he was 15. And then we got another person on board who had grown up in Newmarket and was around during some very interesting times. And we decided our project would go from the 1930s to the 1980s. And we would see what was going on in town, what was going on in the country during that time. And then finally, the town was nice enough to loan us our videographer, Tim. So when we did an interview, Tim would videotape it. So we started out brainstorming a list of people who would be a good interviewee, who would we get a lot of different information about different things. We also, at the time, started writing a list of questions. What do we want to find out about? And we came up with, I'm trying to look at my notes, we came up with about a list of about 50 people. And 18 people decided they did not want to be interviewed, which was fine. And we ended up interviewing about 35 people. So we started interviewing probably in 2023, because it took us a while to get all the upfront stuff done. And we've pretty much, well, we've done all the interviews. We've started doing the editing. So what we've done is we were trying to figure out how we could make this interesting for people. And a lot of the interviews were 45 minutes to an hour long, some were even longer. The transcriptions for some of them were 10, 11, 12 pages. And we knew people would not want to go through all that. We decided we would do a book, we would do video clips, and we would do a documentary. So Chris and I sat down and talked about this whole thing. What do we do? And we kind of broke things down into what we're calling themes, topics or themes, such as, let's see, I have a whole list. Ancestors, language spoken in the home, because we knew a number of our people were French Canadians, a number were Polish, a number were Italian. We had some Greek folks. So we wanted to know what was happening earlier in their homes. Early days, their favorite activities in the summer, in the winter, what school was like for them. Elementary, junior high, high school, teenage years, the mills. Newmarket was a big mill town back then. The rivers was also known for the Lamprey River and the Piscassic River. And how did that influence what was going on? The businesses in town. I was amazed. I moved here in 1973, but I didn't know that all of the different grocery stores in town, this little bitty town of 2,000 people had, you know, an IGA and a First National and on, all these different stores. Clothing stores, shoe stores, lots of restaurants. And then finally, Tim came up with one of our questions, and that was, what makes Newmarket Newmarket? And so we made sure that everybody answered that. Everybody answered a question about what message would you like to leave for future generations? We pretty much went through the other questions with them too, but we were pretty flexible and kind of let interviews go where they would go. Some things came up that we weren't expecting, and so that was fine. So right now, Chris and I have kind of divided up this list of topics or themes, and she's editing some of them and I'm editing some of them, and we're cutting and pasting like crazy and meeting to kind of see where we're at. So we're aiming to get it done by May of this year and turn it over to a publisher and a printer for the book and have the documentary done. And then Newmarket has an annual event. It used to be like a heritage festival, or there were different names over the years, but now it's run by the rec department and it's called the Backyard Bash. So about 2,000 people come out, and there's games and food trucks and all kinds of different things. So we'll have a booth there, and we'll have the book there. And we'll also, hopefully, there's a big screen, I believe, so we can show the documentary. But we can also show it in the town hall. There's a huge screen there too. And it's been so helpful listening to all these other ways, because, you know, I hadn't thought of a YouTube channel. That sounds cool. And some of these other ideas. So that's all I've got to say for now, but I'll let Chris pop in, and we'll also take questions.
I just noticed a comment on the chat thing that someone said, for your book, who will be doing the writing, you or Chris? Yes.
Yes.
I think what has happened is, as we've developed the themes, you find you can't just take excerpts and pop them into, you know, some sort of order without explaining a bit about the context, about national issues. For instance, so much of Newmarket had to do with immigration back in the day. And consequently, the ancestor bit was incredibly important for some of our respondents who perhaps grew up speaking another language rather than English until they got to school. So you've got a number of people that, for them, it was very important to them that their grandmother or their great grandfather came down from Canada, and when he came down, and the challenges that they faced, you know, going to work in the mills at the age of 14 or younger. So those are the kinds of stories that came out of that. But it was important to note what was going on in the world at that time for many of these issues. I guess that's one of the things that came out to me, is that need to contextualize what people were talking about. And with some, we had one interviewee who was 102. She passed recently, but I'm so grateful to have had the chance to interview her. I will say she took it and she ran with it. It was really hard to keep her sort of on this list of topics that I wanted to go through. And I had to respect that her story took a slightly different form than some of the others. We did some interviews in groups, or perhaps a husband and wife. I decided to interview my husband, who was the one who lived here all his life. I've only been here for 50 some odd years. And because we had other interviewees that had been part of his same graduating class, I did them together. Well, I will say live transcribe does not distinguish between voices. So getting through who was actually saying what when I got the actual transcription was something. So that brings another aspect to interviewing, and that is, it's really helpful to get to know or know something about your interviewee, about who you're interviewing. It deepens, I think it deepens the kind of response that you get when you know a little bit about them, or they know that you have this kind of a personal relationship. I guess I could stop talking for now.
That's fantastic, and goes back to that question of preparation, right? Knowing the context of the time period, but also knowing a bit about the individual, I think is really key. So one question I have, I'm keeping an eye on the chat in case there are other questions that come up. But one question I have kind of related to this topic is, where will the original interviews and transcripts eventually land? And how did you kind of start to have that arrangement? Did you kind of figure that out at the beginning? Did you figure it out along the way?
Well, we hadn't thought about it along the way. Actually, until I started going to your workshops and thinking, oh, and actually Chris and I talked about that too, the whole transcript. When we started to say we were going to take pieces from different people and put them in these different themes, under the themes, we thought the Historical Society was the perfect place to put all of this information, because there's already so much there. And we're planning to have pictures in the book too. And a number of those can be taken from the Historical Society. Pictures of what Newmarket was like back in the 1930s and 40s. And then, through the years. Also, Chris has been involved with, I think you were involved with John on the whole walking tour of Newmarket.
Oh, heavens, yes. A pandemic project of ours. When the school called and said, oh, is there a walking tour of downtown Newmarket? Newmarket is fortunate in having, still being a walkable town in terms of, now we actually have sidewalks too. But it's something where you can walk from place to place. And back in 1986, Sylvia Getchell, who was an early historian in town, had a walking tour, and there was a little map, and there were notations, like a 2 or 3 line notation on each place saying what it was and why it was important and all that. So when we got this request during the pandemic for, do you have a walking tour, walking map? I looked at Sylvia's and I thought, oh, a lot of this is out of date, but give me a couple of weeks and I can sort this out. Well, 2 years later, we had the walking tour, which morphed partly because I realized that a couple of lines on the back of a piece of paper don't do it anymore. They don't give you the depth and the breadth of what actually was going on there. And being married to a born in the wool history researcher who immediately sought out the backstories of every place in terms of the people who had lived there or worked there. It was just a wealth of information that couldn't go anywhere else but online. So it ended up being, we discovered the magic of a QR code that brought people to the Historical Society website. And from there, we ended up saying, okay, nobody's going to look at all this stuff. And I realized when I walked it with somebody that you needed an audio. So from the trove of information, we ended up having an audio. So we've gotten used to the idea of stuff's being stored on our website, and that has been going on for quite some time. So it's the logical place to put interviews, links to that kind of thing. So
Fantastic. I don't, the question of tours and accessibility is a whole other question that I'm adding, I just made a note to myself to add tours to the list of possible ways of using oral history. There is a site called Clio. The website is actually theclio.com, and I can put that into the Google Doc as well. That has the kind of you can enter in information, and this is a free site that's also publicly accessible. So if you go to Newmarket and you open up the Clio app on your phone, you can see if anyone's created any entries about the buildings there. But it accepts audio, video, still photo, and those are all linked externally to YouTube, for example. And you can create little entries for each building and then organize them in a tour, which might be another way that people could think of kind of connecting oral histories to places where they are.
That sounds fun.
Yeah. I wrote down a few things, some lessons learned so far in this
Fantastic.
process, because maybe you've kind of figured it out. We were pretty much winging it from the beginning. And it wasn't until your workshop that I realized, oh, there was a book on oral history. Who knew?
There are so many, but when it comes to technology and accessibility, it's very hard to stay up to date on those topics.
So one thing we learned was something takes a lot longer than you think it's going to take. So as I said, we started out in 2022, and I thought, oh, we'll finish this in 2023, and we're still working. Another thing was, don't have really long pre-interviews, because one of our people had a couple instances. I think I mentioned this to you, Holly, when we were talking before, but interviewed a couple and without the camera or anything, just a pre-interview to let them know what was coming and go over the questions, et cetera, et cetera. And, got a really nice interview. And then after it was all done, a few days later, they contacted her and said, oh, by the way, we don't want to be included. Kind of, we're done. Don't send the cameraman over. So we weren't able to use all that, which was a shame. And I think if it had been shorter with just a little teaser of that, they might want to go in and share more or not. I don't know. You don't know the personalities, but the other one was someone who was a friend, and they had a really nice long pre-interview chat. And then when it came time for the actual interview, I guess he figured, well, I pretty much said a lot of what I was going to say. So he didn't bother repeating himself. So it was, shortened, but just word to the wise. I think the other one is do some background research on what oral history is all about. And I think I like the ideas that are starting to come up of other ways to share, rather than just the book and the clips and doing the whole documentary. But we have used the video clips in a couple different ways. So Newmarket has its own television channel, Channel 8.
Yeah.
And so Tim is kind of in charge of that. And so he televises the different meetings in town, the school board and town council and all that. So he's popped those clips in there. So whoever's watching Channel 8, and I don't know how many people are, but those are there. But we also have an annual meeting. It's called Rec Connect that the Rec Department and the Newmarket Business Association put together. And we have our Citizen of the Year and Business of the Year and Group of the Year. And so we were able to show the clips then too, as kind of a little precursor to what was happening. So
That's a great example, kind of what kind of going right back to the beginning of this workshop. Who is the audience you want to reach? Where are they going to be anyway? And can
Yeah.
you meet them there and at least share kind of clips that will get them interested in getting to the full oral history or the documentary or the book. That's fantastic to be able to share where they already are, rather than having a big event and hoping people will come to it.
Right. And nobody came.
Doesn't always happen.
Yeah, the other thing that's happening in a couple of years is Newmarket is having its 300th anniversary in 2027. So this book and all of what we're doing is kind of advance publicity. But there's another book that's coming out the following year. So it's quite different. And Chris is involved in that. I'm involved a little bit doing a story or two, but she and someone else are like the co-authors of the whole thing. So that's going to take a different slant on the town and go back a lot further. They're not, well, some of the people are live people, but there's well, why don't you say what it is, Chris? If we have time, I don't.
Well,
Sure,
okay.
we can end with that about the other project and the other book quickly. If anyone else has other questions and wants to pop them in the chat, please do so. I notice that
There is-
Katie has put in the chat about the link to Clio, which is fantastic.
Yes, yeah.
And then we can go back after that. We can go back and look at their story and the oral history metadata synthesizer and a couple of examples there. Go ahead, Chris.
Okay, I would like to looking back at doing these interviews and what that has resulted in is, I think for the interviewer, the two, some of the more memorable ones are where we were able to develop a relationship so that it was like having a conversation during the interview so that the people felt comfortable. We also did follow-ups in terms of getting their transcribed interview ready and sending it back to the person that we had interviewed or the people that we had interviewed. Sometimes it was because Live Transcribe did some weird thing to names and we weren't sure what they were. But other times it was kind of like, okay, this is what we got out of it. And sometimes they would want to add a little bit. And that's happened a couple of times. And the additions were really quite marvelous. So they're nothing that's on the video history, but they are adding to the history that we have. And I mean, John is still finishing up with one of our last interviewees who said, well, I have a bunch of pictures to show you. And he wanted to add some more to the original transcribed interviews. So I I think that makes it a richer thing. The Historical Society had attempted several years ago to do that sort of oral history interview in the library and set up and had somebody who was on who was going to record it. It was really hard to pull people in a meaningful way, or when they came to the library to do something else that didn't get what we wanted out of that. So the idea of having a sort of a it it was brought up in your earlier part of the hour about having a location during some event where people might hear some of these, but also be invited to participate and to add their own story. Sounds really nice to me, because I think it could be used as a prompt that way to continue the story. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that idea of having a clip, someone talking about, an elementary school they attended that's no longer standing or something. And then, what are your memories of elementary school? And then have people prompting to add theirs. That's a great idea, kind of where you're using, people are listening, and then they're also adding to the story.
Yeah, a continued conversation is kind of what happened.
Yeah. And it also is a way, I think we mentioned maybe even way back in the first workshop, that one of the most common reactions I've gotten when inviting people to do an oral history is, oh, I don't have anything I'm nobody. I don't have anything interesting to share. And so seeing other examples might help people feel like, oh, okay, yeah, everybody has a story. Like that's not.
As a matter of fact, a number of our interviewees agreed to be authors in the other book that's coming up, which is 103 People, Places, and Things of Newmarket. So these are people who probably wouldn't have thought of themselves as authors without having had this interview experience where their story was taken down and honored.
Yeah, valued. Yeah.
Fantastic. That's
And
and that's kind of getting back to that continued relationship with the narrators, and not just kind of extracting their story and moving on, but oral history as a relationship building practice and community building practice. It's great to see that kind of carried over into the other project.
mhm. And I do want to mention, I want to thank the New Hampshire Humanities, because we did apply for a grant this past year, and we were awarded a grant. So that money is going toward the publishing and the printing of the book, and some toward the documentary, and some other supplies and things like that. So that's going to come in very handy. And also we sent out a letter and got some donors and sponsors. And a number of them were people who were in the book, who donated some money to the project. So hopefully we'll have enough to make as many copies as we want.
Karen, thanks for bringing that up. I just want to just jump in really quickly and say, if you are interested in learning more about our grants program, please reach out to me or to Katie. Beth, who's not on this call, would probably be the best person to talk to, or Katie. But there are mini grants that are only $2,000, but which might be enough to get you a lot of pieces of this work done. There are also larger grants. And I should say, we're hearing from a lot of people that just getting a grant, even if it's in the $2,000 range, is often a good way to get other people interested in funding a project. So just want to put a plug in for that. And if you have questions about it, you should definitely reach out to us.
Excellent. Excellent. So there are a couple of questions in the chat that I think are more general questions. So I am going to unspotlight all of us and go back to just I have to unspotlight myself. There we go. And go back to just the general whole group. And I see a hand up also. Nashua Historical Society. So Sally asks, I'm interested in learning more about best practices for long-term preservation, or at least good resources for that. And I think that is such a good and hard question, because we don't know what the next technologies will be. And so I think what everything I've read about best practices for long-term preservation includes kind of the front end part of it, getting the best quality, best audio, best video quality you can get now, and saving it in the highest whatever the audio video I don't know if resolution is the right, but saving the best quality, best file format that we have today, and then entrusting the files to to organizations and institutions that will continue to have that expertise in archiving going forward. So kind of that we'll have a project of maybe every 5 years or maybe every 10 years, kind of doing the work that that Wendy talked about earlier of and Molly, about going back to older recordings and how can we digitize them? What can we do that will make them accessible now? So I think there's a lot more we could go into there, but that's kind of generally the highlights. And one of the things that is in the Google Doc that I'm sharing is a manual of best practices from the Oral History Association on their from their subcommittee on access and management. So that is already a couple of years old, but can kind of address that same question of best practices. And then Jenny asks, how useful is it to interview people who are second generation to a project, for example, the children of someone who did something you are interested in? And I think that's a great question, especially for kind of lengthening the history's reach back beyond the lifespan of people currently. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with how much does that person know? What do they have to add? And it could be a lot. It could be not so much. It depends on how much their parent, for example, or relative shared with them. I think it's worth exploring. I wouldn't not include someone who didn't have firsthand knowledge, particularly if that firsthand experience wasn't something that was available. So I think it could vary widely. There are things that you might be able to think of that if you were talking about things from your parents' or grandparents' generation, stories you heard regularly from your parents or grandparents that you could share, and then other topics that you would know virtually nothing or nothing about. So that probably varies a great deal. Okay, next question, Nashua Historical Society.
Yes. Hello.
Hello.
This is a questions that are a little bit off topic, but we do need some guidance on. With the older oral histories that you have in your collection that you do not have a certificate of gift signed for, how can you use them? These would not have a disclaimer signed with them at all either. Is that something that can only be used internally to the museum? Can you put them on YouTube?
I think that's a great question. I think and it's one I'm currently dealing with myself. So I don't think there's a single answer to that question. I think it's complicated. And there are a lot of factors. I can send you references with a lot more information
Okay.
on kind of the ethics and legal aspects of this. but there are certainly oral histories that are available that do not have an informed consent form or a deed of gift. So it is possible, but it can vary depending on the location, what the legality of it is, and it could also come into play, you know, questions about what is it that people are talking about in the interview? Is there anything that might be considered sensitive or challenging material? And the more sensitive and the more challenging, I think the more comfortable I'd be if you had very explicit permission to use it. And so I think there's kind of weighing that balance. There's a really interesting article that I can send you where it's kind of discussed this really complex, complicated grid that someone could use looking at legacy oral histories and making a decision about, like, is this something we can use? And consent and deed of gift is part of it. Part of it is the audio quality. Part of it is, you know, it goes into lots of different considerations that could be helpful. But I think ultimately it would come down to your organization and whatever advice you might get from your local kind of legal advice that you would get, because it's not a black and white kind of question.
Okay. No, thank you.
One thing that people have done also is kind of try to track down who is the descendant of this individual and contact them as another way of trying to work back to the question of consent. Since the descendant of a given oral history narrator could be kind of the person who would be most directly impacted by it being made public.
Okay, thank you.
No
And,
problem.
We had one other
just
question.
one other question, if you have a second. If you don't
Okay,
mind.
and before you ask the other question, I'll also kind of open that up. If other people have thoughts or ideas about that first question, please jump in.
I'll do that after this question. I do have a thought on that.
Okay, awesome.
Go ahead. You.
I was just going to say, because the issue we have is that we've recently digitized a lot of old interviews. The interviewees have passed away, and we're unsure of the interviewer in a lot of these cases. So just finding out, you know, can that be used for research internally? How would you even cite that if you're using that as a source? So I don't know, do you want to
That's
ask them?
that
About
answers
it.
it.
So yeah, just legally of, you know, done some research, and it seems like very much a gray area. I can't really get a clear answer. So that information does help, and it seems like case by case, find the next of kin if possible, and kind of go from there.
Yeah, and you can, right, so not having the Oral History Association talks about an oral history as being kind of a co-authored publication, right? And the interviewer and the interviewee are the co-authors. So both of them kind of have rights or interest in this oral history that's produced through the interview process. So not knowing who the interviewer is, not knowing who the narrator, whether they consented or not, both of those sides of it can be problematic.
Yeah, and one last
Michael.
thing.
Oh.
Thank you so much, Holly, for this. This has been wonderful and incredibly informative. So
Oh, I'm
while
so
here, I
glad.
just wanted to thank you.
I'm so glad. Thank you. Michael, you wanted to jump in with ideas about deed of gift.
Deed of gift, I just thought it was an interesting kind of parallel. I was working with a project on Holocaust oral histories at one point in time, and the deed of gifts were very clear that the organization had the ability to do whatever they wanted to with them. However, the change between pre-internet oral histories and post-internet oral histories, where the idea of posting them online was enough to get the organization, because it was such sensitive subject matter, to go back as much as possible to the individuals and their descendants before making the oral histories that were done pre-internet, kind of understanding the idea that you would put this out in that way online. So it was an example where legally it was not the issue. It was really because of the nature of those particular interviews that the organization wanted to make sure that there was permissions to do wide dissemination of them. So that strange balance between what's legal and what do you feel ethically comfortable with. I just thought it was a good example.
I think that's a great point. And in a lot of the writing around this issue, it's often kind of legal / ethical, right? Just because something is legal might not necessarily be ethical. And you might be fine ethically with something that turns out not to be legal. So they're not the same. And it's as I just recently, not oral history, but just recently abandoned a whole research project because I ended up coming down on the side of, even though this is completely legal and was approved by the Institutional Review Board, I'm actually no longer comfortable with this research project. And so kind of checking in, and that's where going back to that kind of original mission statement and what you set out as an individual or a group together to accomplish. A lot of the questions that come up, can bring you back to what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Who is this for? And that can help guide some of those ethical questions. But absolutely, the idea that the online publication of oral histories completely changes the whole kind of landscape of being able to imagine how something could be used. And it makes sense that checking back in is the right thing to do. And then, of course, it's not always possible. And then what can you do? Karen, I see you have your hand up.
Please not.
There
Yeah.
you go.
My phone was ringing. I wanted to wait till it stopped. Yeah, we didn't have a written document, but our videographer would ask each person who he was videotaping at the beginning, before he started the videotape, if they agreed to have their, to be videotaped and to have their words documented through the videotape and through the transcription. So I hope that's okay.
Yeah, that is definitely something that is mentioned in the literature as an alternative to a written consent form or deed of gift, that recording that, even if you have the written one, kind of also including it orally is something that people do. It's not something that I have done, but yeah, I think that is definitely a practice that that is used in oral history to get the consent on tape, as it were, as part of the interview.
Good. Because several of them have passed away. Yeah.
So I'm going to jump. I see there's some more in the chat. Does someone have an example of a deed of gift? Yes. So there are examples in some of the resources that are in the Google Doc. And if anyone else has examples that they want to share, or that they know of, if you want to pop them into the chat or email me, I can add them to the Google Doc. But and I'm happy to share an example of consent forms, which is a different kind of a different process, more in the academic setting, in case that's helpful. I can add those as well. Am I missing another question? Oh, about the Library of Congress as a possible landing place for oral histories. The Newmarket Veterans Memorial Trust Committee did a number of interviews with World War II veterans, and those are available at the Library of Congress. And the Library of Congress is also where everything from the StoryCorps project is archived, and StoryCorps has an app that they now offer free for carrying out oral history interviews. It might be something that could be useful for some of the pop-up oral history experiences that people were talking about, possibly trying to use at events in their towns. I'm trying to get back to the oral history metadata synthesizer in case people are interested in taking a look at that.
This is the
Oh,
house.
and now it's
It's a new take
playing
on the dog toy. that was
already on
focused to amaze
YouTube. An
people.
ad is playing on YouTube. Uh, and I'm trying to get to see if I can share. I will mute the ad while it's playing. And then let's see if I'm able to share my video. And it's looking like it doesn't ask you anymore about optimizing for playing video. Okay, so hopefully folks can see this YouTube window, and I will try to make it full screen and play. So this is a little intro video. It's just a couple minutes, or it's less than a minute, about the oral history metadata synthesizer, which is a free interface that you can use to bring in your videos that are on YouTube, which doesn't have to mean that they're public, but bring in your videos from YouTube and your transcripts and your index in order to make a publicly accessible interface. I'm hoping this will work. I'm still muted.
Oral history in the liberal arts.
Let me
Welcome to
rewind.
this video series on the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer, known as OHMS for short. My name is Wyatt, and I am with the Oral History in the Liberal Arts Initiative. In these videos, I will show you how to get up and running with the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer. These videos are primarily for folks working on OLA-funded projects, but anybody who is new to OHMS may find these helpful. The Oral History Metadata Synchronizer is a powerful web-based application that allows oral historians to organize and put metadata into oral history interviews. This makes interviews significantly more accessible for researchers or other interested people. This is an example of an OHMS interview. As you can see, we can listen to the interview here. And this section down here contains a transcript of the interview. And this transcript is synchronized with the video, so we can read through the transcript and see one of these timestamp markers. And if we click on this, we'll be transported to that part in the audio. Alternatively, I can switch to index mode, which shows index marks or chapter marks that the creator of this interview made to organize the interview. If I click on one of these index marks, I can now see a synopsis of the segment, along with a partial transcript, keywords, and Library of Congress subject headings. So these keywords are searchable. So we can go ahead and search something like school. And each segment that contains school will appear here in the search field. And you can do the same thing in the transcript. So we can search the transcript for school, and every instance of the word school will appear in this box right here. Index marks and the search feature make finding relevant content in oral history interviews significantly easier than it would be if all you had was the interview audio. This is what makes OHMS such an incredible tool for oral history. So what we've been looking at so far has been the OHMS viewer, which is how we interact with content that is put into OHMS.
I'm going to stop the video there because I'm looking at the time and realizing we are very short on time. But I wanted to just point out that what he's about to say is that this is the viewer and there's a kind of a behind the scenes, and that's where you update all of the, or where you upload the video and the transcript and the index, all of that, synth is it synchronizer or synthesizer? I'm using the wrong word. All of that is material that you've created that you can upload. And then the difference is that in the I mentioned the other option, their story, and that is a not a free not a free resource, and it does all of that for you automatically, the transcribing, the indexing, and allows you to make clips and do all of those things. And it's great. You still hold on to the data and you can still use it once your subscription runs out, but it is expensive to use it. So those are one option, one free, one expensive, that are great for doing that kind of post-interview work to make it more accessible. So I'm going to end there, invite everyone to please, oh, I will copy quickly into the chat, the link to the Google Doc, but
I think I
believe
just did,
you'll-
Holly.
Ah,
Yeah.
perfect. Thank you
so-
so much. And I ask you to please look out for the survey from New Hampshire Humanities and give us feedback. If you want to jump in now and share any thoughts you have about kind of additional support, additional workshops or events that you'd be interested in. I'd love to hear if people are interested in an in-person oral history get together sharing moment or any other things. I see Sally.
Yeah, I
I'm
just think
gonna
it's
jump in,
really,
Sally, one sec. I'm so sorry. I should have thanked the National Endowment for the Humanities and the United We Stand Project for supporting this financially before you're all off. Okay, Sally, go ahead.
I just think it's really helpful talking to, hearing from Karen and Chris and talking to other people who are in the middle of projects. Some kind of a forum to a round table to get people just talking with each other who are working on similar projects, I think would be really wonderful.
Fantastic. Would people be most interested, and you can share this in the survey if you'd rather, but it would be great to hear if people are interested in virtual or in person or a combination.
Depends on where.
Yeah.
It depends on time of year too.
Mhm.
If we're talking February, maybe Zoom. If we're talking June, in person will be nice.
That's an important factor.
If we can't do it in person because of weather or distance, or I mean, Zoom is better than not, in person's better if it works, but
Yeah.
Zoom's better than not doing it.
Great. And
Agreed.
thank you for Katie, I believe, or maybe Michael, for putting the Martha's Vineyard project link into the chat. That's fantastic if people want to click on that. Nashua Historical Society. I see that you're close to the screen, so I'm wondering if you're about to unmute. Oh, no, you were putting in the chat. You'd be interested in participating in roundtable as well. Okay, fantastic. Fantastic. Well, please share other ideas you might have in the survey. And thank you everyone for participating. Thanks again to Karen and Chris for the case study this workshop, and to Katie for managing all of this, and Michael also for being here today and for working with me to organize and think through these workshops and what might be most helpful. I'm so excited to continue to hear about your ongoing projects. So please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I'll type my email into the chat quickly if you don't already have it from past workshops, but please do reach out, be in touch. I'd love to hear about what you're doing or connect you with any resources, and best of luck on all your projects.
Thanks, Holly, for all these workshops. These are amazing.
Thank you.
Appreciate you
Thank
doing
you.
all
Take
this.
care, everybody.